I just read the
This meeting is being recorded.
I just read the whole thing because it seemed weird to stop.
Yeah, I agree. It does stop at a really weird place.
Just out of curiosity, I know this is a little like not ready to text, but Eric, do you cook? Because I know you said you worked for a chef for a while.
Uh, yeah, I spent quite a few years in food service and picked up some tricks from, I mean, I like to eat nice foods, right? But I, can't afford to go out to restaurants. So I've, over the years learned some techniques, and I feel like, yeah, when I get a mind, I can make a nice dinner party. In fact, I used to do that when I lived in Scotland, and I was the cook for dinner parties. And then yeah, but I mean, since I've been separated from my ex and don't have friends for dinner parties, then I don't cook. I mean, I cook for my son, but I don't do big. I mean, I don't often cook big meals. Most of the time, I'm just looking for something simple that doesn't take a lot of time. So
You strike me as the silent person who doesn't really talk about cooking, but then you go over for a dinner party and you get really good duck confit, and it's like, well, it's nothing. You just cook it in its own fat. It's no big deal. I want to come to Eric's dinner party. That's what I want to do.
I haven't done one since last time I hosted a dinner party was when I lived in Japan. That was some years ago. So since moving to Austin, I haven't had the same kind of setup.
So I'm curious, Eric, how would you analyze your own class in a Marxist sense?
Good
At first I was
Jackson.
thinking like, oh, bourgeoisie, but then you can't afford certain things, which is a restriction. So that seems, I'm curious, how would you analyze yourself in those terms?
It's goodness. It's interesting. Somebody else might know the title of the book, but there was a book written about class distinctions and food presentation, and roughly, working class people, tend to look at a dish and look at the quantity of it, like I need to eat. I'm hungry. You know what I mean? And that's why a lot of times with America we have these huge meals and things like that, for working people, because you're not supposed to walk away with any hunger left at all. You're supposed to fill right up, And then more what's typical of the middle class, or the more, I guess historically bourgeois, is that quality of food, right? Not quantity, but quality of food. But for the 1%, what they look for is presentation. It has to look perfect. Why would they need gold foil, right, on food? Why would you eat, gold foil except for presentation purposes, right? So on that, I mean, oftentimes I tend to just I just want, a mass of food in my belly as a practicality most of the time, but I give myself breaks and again, I'm poor, right? But every once in a while I'll go to Central Market and I shell out on some stuff, but it's like twice a year, right? But I think I also need that because I don't want to lose touch with finer, quality ways of living. So yeah, it's a vexed thing, right? Yeah, in general, I'm poor, but I do like nice foods, especially. Yeah.
When I was an engineer, me and this guy that I worked with, an Irish guy, went to Norway for a trip, and we were in this hotel that apparently was a really nice hotel. It was just like one of the few hotels in the city, and when we got in that night, there was the two of us and then a guy from England, and we went down into the hotel restaurant to eat dinner because it was late at night. We didn't want to have to go out, and it turned out it was a really nice restaurant, where they would like have one plate and there would be two spears of asparagus and some kind of sauce kind of looped across it, and then another one was like some little creamy thing that looked like a flower, and they just kept bringing these things to us. And I mean, this went on for like 2 hours. And then when we were done and we paid, the outrageous amount of money we had to pay for it, the Irish guy looked at us and said, "So you want to go get a pizza?" because we had not had a lot of quantity. Anyway, speaking of bourgeois,
Oh, I was gonna throw this up.
oh, go ahead.
My son's favorite food is sushi. So recently I've started teaching him how to make sushi. So again, on my biannual trip to Central Market, actually I sometimes make a special trip just for tuna. All I do is go and get tuna, and then I shield my eyes from everything else that's in the store, right? I can't wait the tuna, and then I'll come, and then come home and let it thaw, and then slice it up and make some sushi with it.
Yeah, I like sushi.
All right.
Well, I know almost nothing about Soviet era. Well, I know almost nothing about history in general, actually, which is pretty embarrassing. But I certainly don't know a lot about Soviet history. So I found this pretty fascinating, but I also don't know, because I'm not at all familiar with it. I don't know how idiosyncratic his interpretation of the history is. So, maybe some of you guys do. I don't know if, what he says. He ends up, see, is it in this reading? Actually, I guess it's in the one that we haven't got to yet. The one immediately after ours, the collectivization of lands. He ends up sort of being, he says explicitly, I'm not trying to justify all the terrible cruelty that happened, but that he thinks it's understandable. And so anyway, I found it an interesting account, and maybe Ed or Eric or some of you guys have a sense as to how standard an account this is, because I don't know.
Well, what I was trying to do is, because on one level, if you well, I shouldn't say if you did, we all read it, but he's at a level of generality that I was a little surprised about. He refers back to Leninism. He does talk about, did he call it land or agricultural collectivization? And then he referenced the first year of the first 5-year plan, but he didn't go near into detail like I thought he might. But what I was trying to do in reading it was to remember what I thought was his main points about systems of production, like his take on, his idiosyncratic take on all of human history, no matter how different, like the Aztecs or the Llamas or the early capitalism. And so my sense is that he was saying for the Soviet Union to survive in the environment that it was in, given its relative economic backwardness, it really did have to use fairly ferocious means to extract the resources which were shoveled into heavy industry, right? That given the 1930s, given Adolf Hitler coming in January, 1933, there wasn't a lot of choices. There were really no good choices. And so if you're talking about national survival, then what Soviet economists will actually call what they were doing is, if I remember correctly, and Eric, if I get this wrong, feel free to correct me, but I thought they called it primitive socialist accumulation, because they couldn't use liberal economic terms because they were saying they weren't capitalists, right? So, okay, if you're dealing with capital accumulation, it can't be from capitalism because they're the only socialist state in the world, according to them. So that's where they came up with the term primitive socialist accumulation.
But I was wondering, there's one big question was, again, how is this related to the whole general economy thing? But, with regard to your comment, if I understand right, part of the period he's talking about is not only during World War II, but afterwards, and what the Soviets did to keep things going afterwards. And so you know, some of my one of my main questions was why, you know, where was this pressure coming from? I mean, it's certainly during World War II, like you said, there was Hitler, but then after the fact, is he, you know, is he saying, because the first part of this chapter, he focused on how everybody hated them. You know, everyone in the world hated communism in general and the Soviet Union in particular. And was that where the pressure was coming from after World War II? Because again, you know, like why did they feel this desperate need to update their economy from this backward agrarian economy to a fully realized industrial economy? And was it because of everyone hated them, or it was because they couldn't otherwise participate in the world economy, or what was it?
Well, I mean, look at it. I mean, Russia, go back to late imperial Russia, you know, say roughly 1890, for example, even the 1880s. I mean, I'm trying to remember when the clown Nicholas II took over when his father died. It was the early 1890s, like roughly around 1892. At the time of the Crimean War, Russia did not have a railroad track that went from Moscow to the Black Sea coast. And remember, it's called the Crimean War, which means Britain and France had to transport troops thousands of miles away. So the theater of conflict was the Crimean Peninsula, which is a huge embarrassment with Russia because it, you know, remember when that war started, Russia is still fairly high up because it was part of the coalition that defeated Napoleon. And so then if Russia couldn't stop the British and the French from basically dominating the Crimean Peninsula, Nicholas II died really through self-abuse. I mean, he didn't take care of himself, and he got some kind of infection. And so the Russians, and that's where the great fathers are. Alexander II, you know, liberated the serfs, introduced local government, did reforms in the judicial proceedings, but then he was killed by a left-wing group's homemade bomb. And so when his son finally, from his point of view, takes care of everything, it's only in the last couple of years of Nicholas II's father's life that he now thinks the regime is secure, and now he's going to start looking towards the industrialization of the country. Did you ever hear of Sergei Witta? Witta was the finance minister in the last 2 years of Alexander III's reign and the beginning part of Nicholas II. And Witta, what the old Tsar did was start to purchase railroads because how important they were into the economy and to the military. And so under Witta, it was when Witta was, I'm sorry, let me take one step back. What do you do if you're a great power? Like if literally you're one of the most important countries in the world militarily, but your industrial base is 1/10 of all the other great powers, especially the most industrialized Britain, France, and Germany. And so what Stalin faced in the 1930s was what Witta faced in the decade and a half or 2 decades before World War I. Russia being a great power, not willing to give up that great power status, which means it somehow had to find a means by which to funnel resources to create an industrial sector in anticipation of a future war. And so there were peasant rebellions during Nicholas II's reign. There were famines during Nicholas II's reign, but it was in the first part of it that Russia got on the gold standard. You know, the production of pig iron tripled, more railroads were built, a steel sector was actually created. And the number one country who invested in the Russian economy was France. Really, it was, and part of that was because of the alliance between the two countries that congealed finally in, I believe, 1894. If you want to read a very interesting book, it's I don't know if I'm pronouncing the man's name right, but it was Theodore von Laue, Laue, and it was simply titled "Why Lenin, Why Stalin." But he has an introductory chapter which you really could ask, why Witta? You know, because they're dealing with very similar issues. How do we grow the economy when we have such a smaller non-existent industrial base, it's in the face of this environment where we are considered to be one of the great powers, and how we're going to sustain our military. And Nevid, I apologize for talking so long, but one other thing is Russia lost about 10 years of economic growth because of the revolutions and the Civil War. Okay, so Russia didn't get back to the 1913 economic figures until something like, depending on what the figure was, until 1924, 1925.
Eric, were you gonna?
Oh, I mean, I was going to underscore, especially, Ed was absolutely right to bring in the Crimean War. That was a wake-up call for Russia, because Britain and France had sent troops so remotely, and the war kind of oscillated, right? And there was a time where it looked like the Russians were going to fend off and push the British and French back into the Black Sea, but I think it was the British. It was either the British or the French, but I think it was the British actually constructed a railroad as a small occupying force. They constructed a railroad to deliver goods from the port to where the military was a small railroad, and that made a large difference in allowing the British to turn the tide of that war, right? And so the Russians learned, right? Like we did, we made some missteps early on, but we recovered, and we were about to drive them out. And then they came with their industry. Like they came with their ships, with the, they built a little steam engine, built a railroad, and then they had logistics, right? And logistics was huge because of the amount of people that died due to disease, right? So they were able to take care of they lost a lot of, the British lost a lot due to disease. And then when they got the railroad in place, and it was Florence Nightingale, right?
Yeah.
That was, look, small innovations like that drastically turned it. And so, yeah, I agree. I mean, that was a wake-up call to the Russians that they needed to learn how to industrialize as well as the British, French, and the Germans. Otherwise, they'd get their ass kicked again.
So it sounds like to me, you guys are saying there were two basic issues that drove this desperate need for industrialization. One was participation in the economic world order as an economic power, and the other was fear of the West, that the West was going to come in and expand through Russia. Is that right?
Right.
Okay, that's helpful, because he probably just thinks everybody knows that because everybody knows history, but I don't. So that's helpful, because I kept wondering why. Because I think he does a good job of conveying this kind of sense of desperation. But I was like, well, where is that desperation coming from?
Yeah.
Well, the one other thing he was saying before was also because they are, communist, and they accept historical materialism, that they view they necessarily have to industrialize in order to achieve, world communism. As Marx said, it was, and like they said, Marx had thought, the United States might be was better positioned than Russia was to, start a revolution, because of it would be more, industrialized, and more, the productive forces were more developed. And so for Russia, they also feel the need to industrialize more because they're not anywhere near the level that was expected a country would need to do to transition into communism.
Right.
Yeah, that's fair.
Agreed. Yeah, and in the theory, you're right, socialism is something, or capitalism is something you have to pass through to get to socialism, right? You can't, it's not like a misstep. Oh, why did we wind up here instead of in a socialist state, right? No, capitalism is a precondition for the eventual, establishment and evolution of a socialist state.
Right, but also remember, though, Lenin really did. One could argue that in many ways, Lenin was not a Marxist. I mean, Lenin thought that there could be a group of people, the revolutionary cadre, the vanguard of the proletariat, who could act on behalf of the proletariat, even if they did not have the class consciousness to act on their own, right? And so really, I mean, I don't want to get the name wrong, but the book, but was that State and Revolution, where he argues for a one-party dictatorship because of that. So in many ways, you know, I mean, because for Marx, it's these very broad, deep, long historical processes, right? And for Lenin, it's, I think we can give history a push. You know, that under the certain conditions, we can seize power, we can force this through. But Ripley and Eric, you're both right. It's like, okay, now that we're here, yeah, I mean, we have a nation of peasants. I mean, that's you know, we have to build an industrial structure. But Lenin is very odd in a sense, in terms of, he's not an orthodox, to me, he's not an orthodox Marxist, because he actually thought that there was some amount of human agency that a group like the Bolsheviks could actually seize power and act on behalf of the workers. You know, that's what separated him from the Mensheviks, right? The Mensheviks said, no, you have to have a bourgeois republic and development of capitalist industry and commerce, and we go through that, and then we'll be ready.
Yeah, I agree with that. I want to say, I think it was Bataille's point is that's, you know, perhaps it's where, you know, Lenin was wrong in theory, right? Because yeah, while the, you know, I think, you know, one of Bataille's main points here is that in the industrialized West, socialists and leftists were looking to redistribute the excess wealth so that it could be used for personal expenditure, right? Because they were in a position where such a thing was imaginable, right? Like, you can actually create enough food and goods to sustain everybody and give everybody a happy life. Whereas Russia was not there yet. Like, they just didn't have the productive capacity to do that. So anything didn't go to, you know, immediate growth. Anything that would otherwise be expenditure has to be fed back into the, you know, the growth of the productive forces in order just to get to the, you know, to build a system capable of realizing what Marxists and leftists in the industrialized West had almost as a more immediate possibility, right? Whereas, yeah, you know, the Soviets, that was not, you know, that utopia was not an immediate possibility. It had to be developed with, you know, with hard work or brutality, you know, by force.
So here's another question. Since I've got you guys here, you can pick your brains on this stuff. Bataille mentions something that at least I think he does, that I have a vague recollection of hearing when reading stuff about Marxism a while back, that at least the sort of Marxist theory as it came from the man himself was that in order to pull this off, you really needed a worldwide revolution, and that never happened. You just had, like, on some views, just the Soviet Union, and then on others, you know, these scattered communist states, but that in order for it to really be fully realized, the entire world had to roll over. And was that the reason why? I wonder, because you know, Eric said, well, the West had gone through this capitalist phase where they had developed their productive resources, whereas there were other, you know, and interestingly, you know, again, you guys probably know this better than me, but the places where communism seemed to really take off were really the places that were not industrialized. You know, Russia, China, Southeast Asia, South America. And so was the reason why Marx thought you needed the entire world because you needed to leverage the capitalist resources, or was there some other reason? Because I didn't really understand that.
Well, Marx didn't talk about, I mean, if you look at the whole corpus of his work, when it actually talks about the future revolution and then the introduction of socialism is when the working class rules the government, ignores the rights of the bourgeoisie, because they are, well, one, besides being exploitative, they're actually a very small percentage of the population at the time of the revolution. Communism for Marx is little c, the very end. It's basically, I don't want to say it's hunting and gathering, because there is industrial production, but it's a classless, stateless society, you know, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. It was more like capitalism can't exist in one country. And so you're going to have multiple countries at relatively the same level of capitalist development. And if they're at this relatively the same capitalist level of capitalist development, then that means the class relations, right, will be such that the working class will rise up in multiple countries at the same time, because they're in the same, I hate they use the word stage, because that can be overdone and it becomes mechanistic, but they're all at the phase of production. That's why Stalin, actually, ironically enough, with his socialism in one country, one of the reasons he developed is because Trotsky kept on talking about world revolution, and Stalin couldn't stand Trotsky, and part of it was personal, part of it was power. But another reason was, remember, Stalin was older, and so the younger generation coming into the party, with Stalin talking about socialism in one country, it was kind of like nationalistic. Yeah, we can do this. We can build socialism in Russia. Yeah, way to go, Joe. You know, I mean, it was like, hey, we don't have to rely on other people. Right? We can do this ourselves. And so, but you have a massive inversion, right? What had been seen to be global, now everything is funneled into the interests of one country that is said to be socialist. And so to be a good socialist in France, in Germany, in the United States, according to the government of the Soviet Union, you have to be pro-us, because we are the last, right? We're the last best hope on Marxist earth, right? I mean, we're the one carrying the torch. And if it fails here, it's over.
And this is just from watching movies, which, is not a particularly good source of information. Maybe it is, but I get the impression that that until people learned about some of the horrors that were going on, that socialists in the West were actually pretty pro-Soviet, weren't they? Like in the U.S. and in Western Europe, that they were that actually was true. And then they were kind of shocked when they found out what was happening over there.
Well, that's going to.
Go ahead.
I was going to say that it would probably depend a lot on the tendency. For instance, the anarchists were initially generally pro-Soviet Union, but by the 1920s were later. Obviously, the Trotskyists didn't really become a different tendency that was super anti-Stalin until the late 1930s and 1940s. But it is definitely true that the West were more pro-Soviet Union till, I think, especially the 1960s. Especially once stuff like the Gulag were getting more exposure and.
Well, remember Khrushchev's anti-Stalin, his Stalin denunciation speech at the party Congress was at 55 or 56. That shocked the living shit out of so many communists globally. That was Khrushchev really jumping for the brass ring to be the leader all by himself. Yeah, he denounced Stalin at this party conference, and his speech was published, and it was translated very, very quickly. Yeah, so I think it was. Did you ever read and did you ever read The God That Failed? Some of it is a little overwrought, but some of it is very interesting. It's about a half a dozen intellectuals from different countries who became communists and then left the party. Richard Wright has a chapter. Richard Wright wrote an essay for it. Very interesting book. I wish I had had a different title. Yeah, for some people, it was because what Khrushchev was doing was laying out all the bad things Stalin had done, right? And this is the head of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, so it's got to be true, right? So and also part of it was it was very difficult to get any kind of independently verifiable information from the Soviet Union when Stalin was totally in control. Was it Lincoln Steffens who famously or infamously said, "I've seen the future and it works," after he came back from saying the Soviet Union? So there was, and part of it was, part of it may have been naivete, but, part of it was just we know more now about everything that Stalin did than anybody in the West knew in 1940.
I think part of it also is also people, yeah, people just, if they believe in historical materialism, well, the Soviet Union doesn't have to be good, but they kind of are expecting that this is the future. That the Soviet Union won't be the only thing in the future, but that Soviet-style communism might be the future for the world itself. Get on board. And so even if they're critical of it, like parts of it, they're expecting it to be the future. Also, say another thing was also seemed to be disillusioned with also the local communist, or the country communist parties as well. Like in France, a lot of disillusionment after May '68, the student revolts after the Communist Party backed. What was the name of the French president at the time instead of the student revolts?
Oh, de Gaulle.
And he crushed the student revolts,
Yeah.
and stuff like that. And that probably
But
led
also
to a lot
remember
of,
that's the same year that the Soviet Union, under the auspices of the Warsaw Pact, invades Czechoslovakia and closes that down. The Prague Spring.
1968 saw Soviet prestige go way down in Europe, right?
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
sudden and precipitous. But up until that, they had still had quite a lot of sympathizers.
also, I should say that wasn't the only case. I think I read kind of similar thing had happened with the Communist Party in Japan, like almost a decade before, where another student revolt, which they didn't refuse to support. I think it was '59. But it seemed like that was happening in a lot of places where there were revolts, and then the party didn't back them. People ended up becoming more critical of the party because of it.
So you're saying, Ripley, that the French Communist Party is also doing the same thing? Because that's how, at least I understand, the student protests in '68. They felt that the French Communist Party sold out, and were actually scared, basically, of what was going to happen if the situation just continued to escalate. So they made a deal with the government, and that's why a lot of this post '68 French theory is so anti orthodox Marxism, and also particularly this kind of party politics of it. And you get stuff, well, like it's considered, the ultimate spirit of '68 book is anti-Oedipus, and it's really about, yeah, check that off the bingo card. But that's really considered to be, it uses this like a kind of Marxism, but in a very, very strange way. But yet it's very much opposed to that. It's trying to think outside of that kind of party structure that they thought was very much against their interest, I guess you could say. So I don't know if that even relates, but yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I was saying it's kind of similar thing had happened from what I know in Japan, where I don't remember the specifics, but another student revolt in the universities that they also were kind of afraid of, a group that wasn't, where they were envisioning the proletariat revolution as being made up of, and also that we're seeing, a younger generation not obeying the older generations, and they think they supported. I don't know if they were all communist, but a lot were communist.
No, it was. My memory is there's a book titled "The Almost Revolution" that is about the student revolts. To me, it was what's the word that they usually use? It was not a network, a coalition. There were multiple different student groups, and my memory is it wasn't just the students, but the students had liaison with, was it some of the labor unions? Because I think there was a strike that, and I don't remember which happened first, but they were coalescing together. They were working very well, the labor unions and the student groups, plural. And because I think part of it also, de Gaulle was just getting crotchety in his old age, and he wanted to have a very serious amendment to the French Constitution. and I don't remember the specifics anymore about it, but he was being a little heavy-handed and saying, well, you know, you got to do this or I'm out of here. You know, basically, I'm going to take the country and go home. You know, so there were a lot of things kind of coalesced and met, converged in 1968, 69.
Nevitt, like these revolts were like eventually when they boiled over, like it got to like I don't know, a huge percent of the population and because of that there were a lot of Marxists in the student revolt, but I think the description was like people who had different expectations. Some people thought, you know, the revolts should just be about student reform, and other people thought, you know, they should be calling for the, you know, to overthrow de Gaulle and stuff. So some were Marxist, some weren't, but
well, the reason I ask is because what Chase had said is that that some of the people involved in the revolts thought that if I understand what you're saying right, thought that some of the official party members had sort of turned against them and had compromised with the government, and so then the revolt was partly a revolt against that process. Is that correct?
Yeah, so they ended up, I think, making some kind of compromise in terms of raising wages and having some kind of reform with the university kind of organization. But they saw that very much as, you know, a cop-out, I guess, where it was this reform that just kept the same system going. And that was very much against the majority of the actual people involved, their interest, which was to really change the system. A systematic change where instead they just got some watered down reforms, and that was why there is such a feeling of they weren't happy basically with the party politics that had generated that compromise.
Also remember, the late 60s were a very interesting time because so many countries, at least in Europe and in North America, or at least Anglo-North America, there were very strong, broad-based student movements that existed across the countries. And so some of the demands, not only in France, but in the United States, remember, would be student governance. Why don't the students have a role to play in how the universities are functioning? And my guess is that if you see a university where there's a student who's a member of the board, that probably that reform happened in the late 1960s and result. Now it's become toothless because usually they take the student body president, and no offense to student body presidents, but there's no historical memory. I mean, they have no context to be doing anything, and they usually are on there for 1 year, right? Everybody else is usually has what, a 3 or 4 year term, depending on the board of trustees of a university. But that was really also a lot of it was, why don't we have a say in how the university is governed?
So when Bataille says, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Eric. I was just going to ask another question.
I'm going to throw in one thing too, because we kind of started with the question about internationalism as opposed to, you know, socialism in one country. And I wanted to throw in just a couple of things, like the revolutions of 1848 had a very international flavor, which kind of led a lot of the early, you know, socialists to believe that that's what we're looking for here, is this worldwide, you know, kind of phenomenon. Once we you know, light the fire one place, it'll just spread. Get ready for it. And then I think in the 20th century there was a different, you know, especially, you know, after World War II, but yeah, I'm not gonna, I'm gonna speculate it was, you know, there was a presence before World War II, but right, you know, after World War II, the communist aligned countries, or the communist bloc, had this explicit anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist kind of stance, which is why, you know, Cuba, Angola, various countries around the world who had colonial struggles, right? As soon as they won some kind of independence from their colonial masters, joined the communist bloc. So, you know, something you brought up earlier, Nevitt, like why was it that communism didn't actually take place in these industrialized countries, but in lesser industrialized countries. It was because they really nailed it high on our flag, as we oppose imperialism, and so formerly colonized places joined ranks with the Soviet Union in order to maintain their independence. Which again, it leads us to this question: why did the Marxists and socialists envision that they needed a worldwide revolution? Is because they also understood that as soon as you establish an attempt at a socialist form of society in one country, that your capitalist neighbors will keep trying to reimpose a colonial structure. And again, we can look at what happened in Cuba, and Cuba is not isolated. There are a number of other countries, right? They shake off their colonial shackles. They try to establish a socialist society, but early on, while it's still fledgling, it's under attack from again, rich people who want to come in and recolonize and extract the resources.
Well, what's interesting? Go. Sorry. What's interesting when you said that is, and I'm curious if you guys have the same interpretation, because I am sophomorically ignorant of a lot of the history of communism, and I've only read like very, very briefly Das Kapital Volume 1 and understood almost none of it. Well, maybe 2% of it. But the part that I thought was fascinating was on 155, and this is how I interpreted this, was that he mentions that there is almost a virtue to the bourgeois. Like he says that on the top of 155, but rather an industrial bourgeois, that it became generous without maintaining a great reserve. So I'm wondering if he's trying to, from like a Hegelian perspective, look at the virtues of both sides of both the bourgeois and the proletariat. Because then further down in the page on 155, he uses the term necessary. Right at the bottom, he says it was necessary to reduce those non-productive expenditures for the benefit of accumulation. And what I found interesting was that on 155, he said what is necessary. 156, he starts talking about both the virtues of the bourgeois and of the proletariat. And then he makes a comparison between capitalism and communism and how both of them kind of got it right. And then on 157, he says the abrupt leap from Tsarism to communism meant that the allocation of resources to equipment could not be carried out as it was elsewhere, independently of the incentive constituted by the brutal necessity of war. And what I had in my notes was that there's this independent maintenance of industrial equipment when it's not necessary. So in a way, the stabilization of Russia at the time was required for the system. It was necessary for the system to maintain itself. And then once the system was maintained and it had kind of reached its limit, there was this maintenance of the maintenance mode, this maintenance of the industrialization when it wasn't really necessary. So in a way, it was kind of like almost an automaton maintenance that had exceeded the growth of the system, that needed to retract back into the virtues of, say, extraneous giving without productive means, that became more of just producing to have a reserve to kind of defend itself from attack, which I think what he seems to be saying is that there's benefits to both aspects of communism trying to survive in the system to maintain itself when it was necessary, but also at this point it needs to maybe hold back when it comes to just producing for the sake of production and have there be some type of non-productive expenditure that it can almost learn from the bourgeois. Does that make sense?
Well, I think part of what he was referring to is look at the dynamics of the development of capitalism in the West or in the Northwest, England, France, the Low Countries. You had private capital, right? You had private capital, and when I say private, I mean non-governmental. These are people, merchants. Really, from everything I've read, it's the long-distance trade that creates the massive profits that provides the seed money for continued economic growth in early capitalism, 1600s. And then that flows into the slave trade. And the slave trade is absolutely critical for the investment capital that goes into for the first textile mills upriver from Liverpool. And so what he's saying is Russia's different. When the Bolsheviks took over, they inherited a country that didn't have a lot of private capitalists, right? When Lenin took over in October, November 1917, he inherited the largest state economy in the world. The Imperial Russian government owned hundreds of thousands, if not millions, acres of forests and agricultural land and orchards and ponds, lakes. The railroad network was owned by the imperial government. And up until 1914, the sale of vodka was a Russian imperial government monopoly. And the Russian imperial government received 25% of its annual revenue from the sale of vodka. Do you believe that? And then the idiot Nicholas II, in a burst of, I'm going to wrap us around the Russian flag, he said no to the sale of vodka because we're facing a war, we can't be drunk. And so basically he implemented a badly enforced prohibition, at least when it came to vodka. So when people look at the development of capitalism, the further east you go in Europe, the less private capital exists and the state then takes over, because there's no other choice. If you're going to be making foundational investments in the economy, it has to come from the government. Did that make sense, Joseph?
Yeah.
I was gonna point out too that the line you read from the top of 155. I think I was rereading that and I got a different sense of who was being generous, not the bourgeoisie.
Right, it was the left.
Right. Because
Well, when the left no longer opposed the squandering nobility, but rather an industrial bourgeoisie, they became generous. Oh, right. I'm sorry. You're right. It was. So forgive me.
it became concerned with more concerned with the distribution of wealth, right?
Right.
See, and that was the tension in late imperial Russia. Look at the sentence, Joseph, that you led us to. Now the Tsarist Russia of 1917 was not very different from the France of the ancient regime. It was dominated by a class that was incapable of accumulating. I mean, this is the old landed aristocracy that are pieces of shit, and they don't understand accumulation of capital to be the motor force for the economy. It's, I have this large estate and I have all these servants, and what is it maintaining? My standard of living. And the middle class was looked down upon by the old aristocracy. They deeply resented it, and that's why they resented Witte, because Witte was middle class. He actually started out life working at a train station, and so they thought, here's using Bushy in a really negative way, but here's this parvenu, just because he has some brains, he thinks he's going to be dictating government policy, a piece of shit. And it was because of the pressure from the aristocracy that Nicholas II, I don't know, was it 1903 roughly, kicked him out as finance minister.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Nevid. I should have stressed that the idea of virtues wasn't like a classic Greek virtue sense, but more of like for the sake of stability, because in 156 he goes over that in great detail.
Well, that was the New Deal, right? That's another argument.
No, but then look at the next sentence. The inexhaustible resources of a vast territory were unexploited for want of capital. Right? I mean, that was always Russia's problem. Oh, Nevitt, before I forget, the very interesting thing of Chinese Marxism is when Marx was translated into the Chinese for the first time, the Chinese translator chose to translate the word proletariat to the Chinese word for propertyless. And so that all of a sudden just changed the applicability of Marxism, right? Because the vast majority of the Chinese people did not own a clod of dirt. Can you imagine if they had first said, no, it's working class, because China had some industry, but it would have been very small. So yeah.
I'm wondering if you would like compare the expansion of communism to like the duck grass that he mentioned earlier in the text. Like the war necessitated the need for the expansion of the system to continuously produce the maintenance of the means of expenditure. So like the system had to maintain itself because of war, but when that war was over, then that system was closed, and now you have this excess energy, or excess, he would call it excess energy, I think, that needs to be productively, not productively handled, it needs to be non-productively just expelled. So because Bataille was a socialist, wasn't he?
I don't think he was at least not in any kind of a conventional sense. I think he was kind of vaguely a leftist, I would say, but he was definitely not any kind of an orthodox Marxist or socialist. I'm not totally sure about all that, but that's at least my impression.
I think he'd probably consider himself to be a socialist, but I think most socialists would agree that he's, or at least unusual interpretation of what socialism is might be true.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that sounds about right.
With regard to the resources, from at least from what I gather from what Bataille is saying here, is that the Soviet Union never got to the point where they had excess resources, because in this, this is going back to what Ed and Eric were telling me when I was asking why, because after World War II, they didn't stop plowing resources into the means of production. They continued doing that. So they never got to the point where they had excess resources that they had to expend. And so, my question to Ed and Eric was, well, then why did they keep doing that? And their answer was, well, because they wanted to continue to participate as a major player in the world economy, and because they were under threat from Europeans. And so they had to continue to develop their industrial power so they could continue to be a player. And so, I mean, I kept wondering what he would say about today, but at least from what Bataille says, up to the time he's writing about, they never actually got to the point where they had excess resources. In the way he characterizes it, it's like they almost had no choice but to put every last bit of energy they had into the development of the means of production, and they never got out of that.
And remember, Nevitt, the very specific conditions or experiences of World War II. I mean, the United States had Pearl Harbor bombed and two Aleutian Islands taken by the Japanese. For God's sake, the German army could hear the church bells in Moscow. That's how close the army got. So could you, the equivalent to me would be, given we're talking about the 1940s, imagine the German army or armies landing on the Atlantic coast of the United States and pushing all the way to the Mississippi River. And then the United States is able to push from the Mississippi River and drive the German army into the Atlantic Ocean. Can you imagine what east of the Mississippi River would look like? That's what the Soviet Union looked like, by June of 1944. It took them from, December of 41 to June of 44 to gain back the territory they had lost from the German invasion.
And I can't remember the number, but I remember someone telling me once about the number of men lost in the Soviet Union, that after World War II, there was this massive loss in the male population because of that event.
Well, you don't think of the Russians and the Soviet Union as being sentimental, but for a good 30 years after World War II, remember what they called in Russia, the Great Patriotic War. For 30 years after the end of World War II, the couples on their wedding day in the Soviet Union would go to the cemetery and put flowers on the graves of the relatives who had died during World War II. Because so many people, it could have been starvation, right? Exposure, It isn't just taking a bullet, being collateral damage. Is there was such an upheaval to the economy and a scorched earth policy and suspicions of the Germans. And then obviously when the Soviet army came back, they were suspicious of the people who had survived. So it was a living hell. And so can you imagine? I mean, my parents were very patriotic. They did not go to anybody's, they didn't go to anybody's cemetery on the day of their wedding. But that was just, everybody did that in the Soviet Union for 30 years.
So I think it's great that we have, Ed and Eric to give this history that I'm like you, Nevin, I'm pretty ignorant of this stuff. So one thing that I found that was interesting to me, and by interesting it means I actually have some kind of capability of giving a theoretical kind of analysis of it. Oh, by the way, apologies for my odd lighting. My light bulb went out. And then, yeah, okay, anyways. So
That's fine. It's just a terrifying closet again. No big deal.
Yeah, although I was thinking, if the light is on in the closet, but not out here, does that reverse the relationship of, terrifying and not terrifying, where I become terrifying and the closet is actually this beacon of light, literally, where
no, I'm still terrified of your closet.
The closet before was that it was dark. It was this recess where you didn't know what was going on there.
No, but what it does for me is I'm waiting for some, like a movie, I'm waiting for something to come out of the closet and get you that you will not be able to see.
Yep.
Yeah.
100%.
Well,
still scary.
So, I mean, if anybody sees anything coming out of the closet, please let me know. I mean, that half a second might be the difference. Yeah.
We got you.
Thank you. Okay, so the part that I thought was interesting was about the communist dissidents that he refers to, or basically it's the non-communist world and the opposition against, I guess, not only just Stalin, but kind of throughout. And he describes this very much in terms of Nietzsche's idea of nihilism, which we talked about last time. Was that last time? Yeah, that was last time. And this kind of seemed to confirm to me that he's working within that problematic. The way he describes it is a kind of impotence, like a failure of imagination, but also a kind of failure of of belief and hope and whatnot. And it sounds very much like a death of God kind of thing, where so in the gay science, Nietzsche talks about, the death of God, but as this event where the kind of cardinal points that situate a society have suddenly gone, and now there's this vertiginous movement where we have no more anchor to give us some kind of definitive meaning, some kind of definitive ground from which we can make sense of who we are. So it seems like he's talking about that in terms of the non-communist world, and also that there's this kind of anguish of, I think there's also a lot of Kierkegaard also going on in here, but there's also this kind of anguish of not really having some kind of sense of purpose or any kind of a unity. He talks about, this individuality, a narrow individuality poorly conceals an exasperated fear. So there's kind of the opposition that he makes it sound is very kind of pathetic. you know, their idea of an individual is essentially stupid or whatnot. At least I'd call it that. One thing that I think is interesting about us talks about them is, yeah, depressed. It willingly surrenders to the contradictions that it bears within it. It lives from day to day, the blind, rich, or poor, depressed, and its speech has become an impotent protest, even a groan. So there's no, absence of ascendant ideas, the absence of a hope that would unite and elevate. America is now situated first and foremost in relation to the doctrine and the reality of the Soviet Union. So then he talks about 149, how it's very much a reactive kind of thing. So the communist dissidents has shared the sterility of the other active tendencies within the democracies, for it is informed by an aversion, a rejection, and not by a resolute hope arising from its own resolution. I just realized he's probably talking about the people that have actually defected from the Soviet Union, at least there. But I thought that was interesting that he's talking about this in terms of not only this kind of impotence of forces, but then he's also talking about them as a kind of active tendencies, but that they're reactive themselves, which this is the way that, at least this is Deleuze's reading of Nietzsche's idea of nihilism, is that it's, so there's reactive forces, but then those reactive forces make up a will, which is a kind of complex of forces, which can be either affirmative of itself or negative, which is denying of itself, which that's the ascetic ideal and whatnot. So he's talking about these active tendencies, but yet they're still reactive in this multiple sense. So it sounds like he's talking about that idea of a kind of becoming reactive of these active forces, this historical domination of the negative will. So does that seem like at all like a legit inference that I'm making? And you know, it kind of makes me think, you know, okay, he seems to have this interesting understanding of the Soviet Union and Stalinism as basically they did the best they could with an odd situation. There's a kind of sort of deterministic element to it, but how do we understand, you know, that in relation to what's going on with the other side that he's talking about as this kind of, you know, increasingly nihilistic force that suffers this, you know, lack of any kind of unifying idea? Does he see that also in the same way as this kind of, well, we're trying the best we can, you know? I'm not sure, but yeah.
Thanks for bringing that up. On page 148, above the section that says the intellectual positions with regard to communism, it is, and he about halfway down, he says, and Europe is not alone in being shaken, but Asia as well. Despite its military and industrial superiority, America itself is growing tense, and the indignation it expressed in the name of the narrow individualism poorly conceals an exasperated fear. Today, the fear of the USSR obsesses and disheartens the whole non-communist world. Nothing is resolved, right? Sure of itself, endowed with an uncompromising will to organize except for the USSR. Essentially, the rest of the world lines up against the latter through inertia, right? What I was really shocked at that when I read that, and then I thought to myself, well, you know, I think that was very insightful of Bataille to be developing this, because when you think of the end of the Cold War, right, the Soviet Union falls apart in 1991. what does the West do? And I know that's a very broad statement. That's probably unfair. So what did the West do? But think of what, especially the United States, right? The United States was supposed to be the head of this multilateral coalition against the godless communists. What did we do? I mean, did we coalesce around government and socioeconomic principles? You know, did we make life better for lots of people? Or did we start having arguments? And then, you know, Clinton scandal in his second term, a hotly contested election. I mean, one could argue that representative government is weaker now in the United States than it was when the Soviet Union fell apart, right? Because the United States and the West kept on saying what it was against so much, it didn't articulate and develop and work on what it was for. And I think that's Bataille's critique of the West right here in that paragraph on page 148. Which is like, yeah, you said you hated the communists, but you didn't have the candle power, you didn't have the work ethic to come up with a robust, living, new take on economic and political liberalism, or what you want to call your animating idea.
Yeah, and I'd tell you my ideas and values, but that just sounds way too Maoist to me. That's communist talk. Maoist. Sorry,
You're a Maoist?
No, I was playing off what you were saying, like not giving you my ideas, but attacking in opposition. Sorry.
Sorry
No.
about
Let me read this in response to Chase's comment on page 150, right in the middle of the page. At the basis of the democratic idea, the bourgeois idea of the individual, there is assuredly deception, avarice, and a negation of man as an element of destiny, of the universal action of that which is. The modern bourgeois appears as the poorest figure of a person that humanity has assumed, but this so-called person, inured to the isolation and mediocrity of his life, communism offers a death leap. And it sounds like, I don't know, this seems to fit with what you were saying, because, you know, in the previous chapter, the bourgeois world, he seemed to, you know, as you were saying, suggest that the kind of the end of this process that started with, you know, the medieval world, and then the secularization of that world, and then Luther, and then Calvin, and then capitalism. Part of that was this, like you said, increasing nihilism, this sort of taking all the meaning and value out of life and reducing life to nothing but a bunch of individuals in economic relationship with one another, and stripping all other meaning and value out of it. And then if you think of this chapter as following right from that, then, you know, he could be, that seems to fit, you know, what he says about this modern individual is just this kind of shell of a human being. And then the communist ideal, anyway, provides this alternative. At least some people see it as that, you know, and because, you know, like last time I had raised this question, does Marxism carry, at least in tone, some of the sort of Christian ideals in terms of humanity, not in a religious sense, but in a fully secularized sense, you know, this sort of community of people. And we have, you know, we work together in this community. And so I guess putting all that together, I wonder if he's saying in that passage that then, you know, this sort of meaningless, broken individual might see communism as a sort of salvation. You know, you could take this leap, but then it turns out to be a death leap, because at least on Bataille, and I'm not qualified to say much about this, but on Bataille's reading, you know, the communism, at least Stalinism, was so extreme that it didn't provide any scope for individual expression at all. And so, you know, so you have this sort of this culmination of nihilism in sort of laissez-faire capitalism. You have the promise of possible, you know, of possibly falling, you know, getting out of that by this leap into communism, but that turns out to be a death leap, because the individual is almost completely extinguished in that environment.
Yeah, so I think another part to add on there is this continue on from where you were reading on 150. He says, to be sure, the person refuses to leap, but does not become a stirring hope for that fact. So that very much, there seems to be that he's talking about Kierkegaard's idea of, the leap to faith and whatnot, saying that, okay, there's this hesitation. Essentially, that's the kind of bourgeois world. And then, yes, there's this offer of a leap that actually has some kind of belief in itself with the USSR, with Soviet communism and whatnot. But then, yeah, there's this refusal to leap still at the same time from the bourgeois world. And then at the same time, okay, but then Kierkegaard would say, yeah, maybe you can't take that leap, but there's at least a kind of a stirring hope to be able to be, equal to the fact of striving to be able to take that leap. But even that seems to have evaporated, because really there's more of just a kind of fear of taking any kind of leap, it seems like. Yeah, I'm still not sure exactly where he sees this going, but I think Ed, I think you're right, definitely, to compare this to modern day. Reading this, it reminded me so much of just like, oh, this is our life, like absence of ascendant ideas, in the absence of a hope that would unite and elevate. I think that kind of defines our moment. And there's no Soviet leap of faith that we could take. There's nothing like that. So it's even more despondent. And the way that these kind of reactionary forces kind of they did, in a sense, kind of lead to a unifying force, which was neoliberalism and globalization and whatnot. But that itself has kind of become this singular kind of thing, and there's no real alternative to that. That seems really to define these things. And also, this reminded me of basically what's happening in Russia today, where, I'm not sure exactly all the the ontic situations of, yes, using Heideggerian terminology, of Putin and his decisions, to invade Ukraine or whatever. But okay, so if any of y'all know Alexander Dugin, this Russian political, he's a political philosopher. Ripley, you know who he is? Yeah, okay. So I've looked a little bit into him, and it's kind of interesting that a lot of this sort of reminds me of what he talks about as, we need some kind of an opposition to globalization, to liberalism and all these things, because there is a kind of, hegemonic principle that is kind of taking these things over. But Russia is different. We don't have the same thing going on as Europe. Russia needs to be this vanguard of revolutionary resistance against the West and against liberalism, and have a different order. But at the same time, it's not at all a communist thing. So he's more aligned with a kind of a very traditional, sort of orthodox, almost feudalistic kind of ideas, in a sense. well, he believes in, I think he calls himself a conservative, but he says that there's good things about fascism, for example, but also some bad things. But so this is the guy who wrote the textbook on kind of geopolitical theory that people in Russia would read today. And I think does offer some insight into some of the situation there. But
Do you know when he wrote what he was writing? Is he from the 1920s?
no, he's still alive today.
Oh, okay, because go ahead.
Yeah, so he wrote this one influential book at the beginning of I think the very late 90s, I believe, but he's still continued to write. He's still writing books today. And yet that the fourth political, I can't remember what it's called. That was pretty recent. But yeah, I don't think Putin doesn't read philosophy, but I think there's probably it's influential in Russia, basically.
Yeah. Well, he has people who can read things to him. Now, it's what you're saying is well in line with. I don't want to overstate it because, but you know, there was an older imperial Russian sense of Russia being the third Rome. You know, the transference of the empire from Rome to Constantinople, and then the daughter of a czar married. No, it was the daughter of the last Byzantine Empire married the Russian czar, and so it was this sense. But there's also this kind of the sense of Eurasian, that Russia is distinct. It's not part of the West. It's not part of the East. And there was I apologize. I will try to send it to you all. I thought I had it, but there was a person who was very much writing in the 1920s that helped to resurrect the idea of the uniqueness of Russia and Russians and Russian culture or Russian civilization. That's why I in this regard, I'd want to kind of separate it from economics, and it's more of the civilizational, right? The almost ideational, you know, what are the great ideas, or what about the soul of Russia that Russia can provide the world that is unique? Yeah, really, Russian exceptionalism. Thank you, Eric. That makes it unique and very different from the East or West. And that a kind of in your face, why do you assholes in the West think everybody wants to be like you? Why are you so arrogant, you pricks? Shut up. You know, other people can be proud of their traditions that are very long standing, that have nothing whatsoever to do with baseball, apple pie, or the American way. And so there's a kind of interesting dynamic in this, Chase, where you have it's both confident and lacking confidence, right? It's a really odd, interesting combination where it's like, hey, we're bad, we're nationwide, but yet there's this sense of, well, if we are, how come we find ourselves in this situation again and again and again? But so that's why you have these vacillations.
Which is fascinating how much that applies to modern day times, because right now with Archbishop Kirill, he's making an appeal to anti-Western sentiment to justify the Ukrainian invasion. Like, he's actually saying part of what makes the Ukrainian invasion a moral bastion of Russia is because it's trying to purify the Western influence in there. And he actually blamed it on homosexuals, because he is the bastion for the authentic Russian Orthodox Church, the true Orthodoxy, and he is affronting Western thought. So that's extremely applicable to today's situations.
Yeah, well, a couple of the authors, one was Lev Gumilev, and the other was a Russian philosopher who seems to have influenced Putin, is Ivan Ilyin, Ilyin, who actually, though, he was anti-Bolshevik, but they both were. That's the interesting thing. Do you know why so many Russian intellectuals were against the Communist Party of Russia, of the Soviet Union? Because it was based on an idea from a German. Marxism is an alien ideology. It's not Russian. It's been imported and imposed on us. I mean, think about that for a second. It's not like welcome to the gulag. It's just like that kraut. What are we doing running our government based on a German? Have we lost our minds? Why don't we have faith in Russian ideas?
Oh, yeah, there's this kind of conspiratorial thing like what used to be, which was like by some Russian nationalists when like the Lenin was going that Lenin was some kind of German agent because he was spreading Marxism there.
Right.
He must be a German agent if he's spreading, a philosophy that comes from Germany.
Didn't the Germans like put him on a train and send him to St. Petersburg in order to help them, themselves kind of eliminate the threat of the Eastern Front? I mean, there might be some truth to that theory.
I mean, the German imperial government treated Lenin like a virus. They put him in a boxcar, didn't let him out. And when they got to the frontier, they opened the door and they pointed and said, "You go that way." Cause trouble in your home country. Do not come back. I'm serious. They threatened him. They said, if you come back under our authority, you're going to be lucky if you just sit in jail for the rest of your life. They knew how dangerous Lenin was.
I have a question more, I guess, for Eric and Ed too, and anybody, Ripley as well. So in this reading, the way I interpreted it was that Bataille was saying that at some point Russia and communism became a closed system, and part of my initial reading was that it became a closed system when it didn't have no longer needed the expedition of war. But from what I'm hearing from you, Ed and Eric, is that the Soviet Union constantly thought of itself as being at war. So at what point did it become a closed system?
I mean, what do we think, or what do we think Bataille thinks?
BS. I mean, I'm kind of curious to both, because what I thought Bataille said was it became a closed system when it was no longer needed at war. But I also need to keep in context the things you guys brought up, which is that the Soviet Union was still going on at that time. So I guess we have a little bit more insight, as you said.
Well, I go ahead, Eric. What do you want to take a? I don't want.
There was a brief period after World War II, I think, where he quotes the I think it was the Soviet economic minister who was saying, yeah, we less of our GDP is going to back into the system to grow the means of production, but still it's a majority of it as compared to World War II. And that, to me, there's a bit of a curiosity, but there was what, a year and a half gap between the end of World War II and then like where the Cold War became undeniable. But I want to say even before World War II was over, from my understanding, many intelligent people on the ground could see it coming around the corner. So I want to say, again, with Stalin still in charge of the Soviet Union, there was no let up,
Yeah, Stalin's Marxist-Leninism was very sober, very cold water and some bread. I mean, there was no embellishments. It was very severe. You almost can see his training in that Orthodox seminary when he was a teenager come through in his writings. It's a little strange. Stalin believed, I'm not saying that he was correct in this, but Stalin thought that the United States was indirectly threatening the Soviet Union over diplomatic compromise, or Truman was going to drop the bomb on him. And so from Stalin's point of view, the Soviet Union had to develop its own atomic bomb as quickly as possible. And that's what drove it to then have its first test in 1949. And remember, if you really extend the logic of socialism in one country, You have the weird juxtaposition or the overlay of expanding the socialist economy by converting, right, by redeveloping under so-called socialist principles the economies of Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Poland, East Germany, right, the so-called satellite states. But you can see that as meshing very well with traditional Russian concerns to have a buffer area in case the relations go really bad and there's war. You know, let them have to go through East Germany and Poland, you know, before they get to Soviet territory. And there was a fascinating note or letter that Stalin wrote to Roosevelt and Churchill. It was one of the last things that Roosevelt read from Stalin before he died in early April of 1945. And if you don't know it's Joseph Stalin writing it, you'll think, crap, this guy is an international realist. You know, he's Hans Morgenthau, he's Machiavelli, he's Hobbes. You know, it is very looking at this as distribution of power and security. And if you haven't noticed, we've been invaded by way of Poland 3 times in less than 200 years. And so we're, well, maybe 200, and, you know, Napoleon 1812. Yeah. So, I mean, this isn't academic. This is not theoretical. This is a core security interest of the Soviet Union. So for Stalin, just because they had Eastern Europe and maybe Mongolia and then China in 49, that wasn't enough, right? Because think of the implication. I mean, if you are a Marxist and you do see, from your point of view, the good developments of the Soviet Union, of Eastern Europe, of Mongolia and China, North Korea, then what does it mean? The job's not even half done, right? You have to continue just the way the capitalists say you have to grow. Stalin would say that the socialist realm would have to grow, or maybe there's going to be a problem. All right, maybe there will be this stagnation that we can't get out of. Does that make sense, Eric?
Yeah, totally, very much. And I want to, sorry, underscore or underline the point that you made is that, yeah, immediately after World War II, with their Soviet project, right? I mean, Russia as a nation had been attacked 3 times, right, in less than 150 years. But then add to that, we're trying something new, which threatens the powerful interests in our nearby industrialized neighbors, right? They're going to take every opportunity they can to undermine us and undo our social project, right? So they had a mission to catch up to the industrial capacities of the West as quickly as possible. And the end of World War II, they still had a lot of ground to make up. I mean, they had to recover from the devastation, but they still had a lot of ground to make up, just so that they could hold their own in their mind, right? Just so we can hold our own and not be toppled so easily by a coalition of the West.
Yeah.
You know, one thing I wonder, you know, sometimes I wonder if, and again, some of you are in a lot better position to know than me, but I wonder if some of these political movements end up, well, just let me say what I'm thinking. I'm thinking, like, for example, evangelical Christianity is supposed to be this Christian thing, but then what happens is it gets meshed with this political movement, and then the political movement is really whatever the political movement is, and it's just espousing Christianity, you know, for, I don't know, sociological and political reasons or whatever. And I'm wondering, you know, some of the stuff you guys are talking about, does that sort of thing happen with communism too? You know, when you were talking about the sort of realpolitik thing going on, that you have these Marxist ideals, but really what happens is once you get people in power, really what they're concerned about is maintaining and developing power. And Marxism is just kind of, you know, it's the philosophy that we name check because the people in our society like it or something like that.
Yeah, very much. I'm in support of that. I'm reminded of Ned Beatty's speech in the network. You know the point I'm bringing up, right, Ed? Because he says, what do you think the Soviets are doing over there, right?
Right.
The same things that we are. They're drawing up their cost benefit analysis, their mini-max solutions. It's all a global system, right? And then another point to underscore is, there was what was it? Frederick Pollock, was an economist associated with the Frankfurt School, and I don't think he originated this, but I think he developed it. The idea of state capitalism, and basically, he was, I think he was writing in the late 30s or early 40s, but basically, his argument was that, if you look at the New Deal in the United States, if you look at what Hitler's done here in Germany, and if you look at what Stalin's achieved over there in Soviet Union, these are all forms of state capitalism, right? So from the perspective of certain leftists in the West, right, the Soviet Union was practicing capitalism. It was just that the state was the single monopolist capitalist in all the industries, right? But this again, right, still doing our cost benefits analysis, still mini-max solutions, still ascribing to the same logic, right? So yeah, it's been, it's one of the things that's been in the air and part of the debate, right? Was the Soviet Union really even as Marxist as they say they were, as they claim they were, right?
Well, Lenin
Yeah.
actually did.
Sorry,
Well, actually,
go ahead.
okay, didn't call the USSR state capitalist, but he did say that the transition from the USSR to communism would entail a form of state capitalism at one point,
Right.
which was like if you look at the difference between like Lenin and Stalin's interpretation of what socialism would mean. For Lenin, you could call the USSR socialist because it was, it's got a vanguard that's dedicated to creating communism. It's on the path to socialism, but he wasn't denying, he didn't claim it actually achieved, that they were actually rid of capitalism. But for Stalin, socialism in one country, the building of the productive forces is itself socialism, which is, or at least being a bit, I'm being a bit broad here, but I'm saying, but kind of the basic idea.
And this one I don't have an immediate, I can't find an immediate proof of. I want to say I heard it on the radio once upon a time in passing on NPR. So maybe Ed can confirm or deny this, but I remember hearing that in a few years after or Ripley, in a few years after 1917, some of the Soviets had actually floated the idea of, because confronting the fact that we're going to have to do something like state capitalism, they actually went as far as floating the idea of instituting their own stock exchange.
Well, remember the disaster of war communism. Right, I thought that's what Bataille was referring to when he referred to early Leninism. I thought he was referring to war communism, and then there was such a decline. Actually, St. Petersburg, Leningrad, Petrograd, and Moscow lost. One of the cities lost something like 50% of its population. The other lost 25. Literally, not only did Russia lose 10 years of economic growth, it actually became more rural, roughly in the 10 years from 1914 to 1924. But there was also a, what was your question, Eric?
I forget. So I think we started from Nevitt kind of pointing out how, these ideals get watered down or they get subverted.
Oh, it was the background was NEP, that Lenin introduced the new economic policy, because if Lenin understood anything, it was power. And Lenin actually had to threaten to resign as head of the Bolshevik government for the Politburo, for the Central Committee, I don't remember its exact name, to approve the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Imperial Germany. I mean, that's how far he had to go. If we don't reach a peace agreement with Germany, we are going to be overthrown like Kerensky was. And I don't care how bad this is, how vile this is, you have to approve this. And like 2 of the members didn't show up because they couldn't vote yes, so they just didn't even show up to the meeting, and it passed by a divided vote. And then when Lenin introduced the new economic policy, which allowed businesses up to 10 employees, private plots of land, things like that, some of the, for lack of a better term, left-wing Bolsheviks actually described the NEP as an economic Brest-Litovsk. They viewed it as a betrayal of the revolution. And Stalin was very careful in his comments about it. And who was the real intellectual in the group? Bukharin actually used the French phrase, and he was really considered a nep man. It's a French phrase that would mean enrich yourselves. And that went a little bit too far for some of the Politburo folks. So there was tension within the Bolshevik Soviet Communist government through the Civil War and through the 1920s. And Trotsky's greatest mistake was underestimating Stalin, and Stalin always knew his main opponent was Trotsky. Did that help in any way? Talking about the new economic policy, putting it in the broader context.
I think so, because it helped me at least come to a new opinion that it's not so much the militaristic aspect of communism, but like the accumulation aspect that makes it rather similar. So it's just continuously growing in a way, and trying to maintain itself, which may be what Bataille is trying to say, is that communism, as it continuously accumulates, is in of itself what is making it a closed system. Maybe that's what he's saying, and then similar to what you guys are saying. That's just an idea I'm working with. I'm not sure if it's accurate or not.
Well, I wanted to ask all of you, are you getting a sense from Bataille that when he's looking at economic systems, that he is making the argument that if an economic system stops growing, it's going to die?
I don't think you would say all economic systems, maybe capitalism, but because you said system, sound like he said he said there could be equilibriums at times, but in that case, that means a system must always have an excess and either put that to some use, either productively for growing or unproductively, all sorts of ways. It goes over constantly in different ways. I don't think you necessarily say system will necessarily die if it can't grow. You might agree that capitalism would die if it doesn't grow. I don't know, but I don't think universally.
I keep seeing this theme of production and accumulation for the sake of production and accumulation's sake being something that's strong with him. And he keeps giving all of these different examples of it. Like when we just start going into the aspect of using production for the means of production and accumulation for making it more and more productive, whatever system of thought it is, there's something inherently dangerous in that and unsatisfying.
So I read Bataille as saying that's an explicit feature of the bourgeois revolution and the growth of capitalism, and then one that is like I guess if we're in word but not in deed, opposed by the the communist antithesis, right? But in deed, it finds no other choice but to again primitive communist accumulation, right? It shouldn't again with the but Bataille's pointing out with the growth of with capitalism, the bourgeois revolution, like humanity loses its humanity. It all becomes part of a machine which constantly feeds itself with the demand for growth, which I think Ripley was I agree pointing out it's a feature of capitalism that it demands growth, but it's not necessarily a feature of other economic systems. The feudal Middle Ages, you could have continued with expenditure through monasteries and what have you indefinitely. Capitalism, on the other hand, explicitly requires growth. And then communism, ideally doesn't necessarily require growth unless it's going to try to survive in a world that's surrounded by capitalist competitors and it needs to catch up, right? So, according to Marx and most of the socialists, I want to say that we don't have to take whatever productivity that doesn't go towards, nourishing our bodies and keeping us alive, we don't have to feed that back into the system in order to grow the economic system. We can actually distribute it, enjoy our lives. But that's not, when the Russians did it, they weren't in a position where they could actually realize that. They had to do a whole bunch of catch up before they could create a system with genuine expenditure, like, expenditure that honors humanity, right? That's I think that's something that Bataille is driving at, right? Expenditure, if you're not growing, it's going to expenditure. And if you're not conscious of that, that expenditure can be destructive or terrible. But if you're conscious of it, then you can maybe take some kind of, influence the direction of your expenditure. The capitalist society doesn't leave much room for expenditure because it wants everything to go back into the growth of productive forces, right? Socialism and Marxism wants to allow for expenditure, but historically it started in Russia, which is in the least, one of the least positions to allow for expenditure. It had to go back into growth.
But wouldn't he say? I thought he would say that at least capitalist systems as they exist today actually do have a lot of expenditure because there's a lot of luxury, and so and what's happened is the bourgeoisie has plowed a certain amount. So I thought that he was saying that in the case of capitalist systems, some of it goes into the continual growth in the means of production, but some of it there is excess, because that's why he was saying one reason you get war is because these capitalist societies have this excess and they can't get rid of it fast enough, and so they start wars. And so, but I think that the general thesis seems to be, like Ripley was saying, that all systems, natural, social, whatever, are always generating, they're always producing. That's going to happen. And what happens, that production depends on the conditions in the historical, biological, and social conditions. Some systems will produce so much that they have an excess, in which case they have to figure out what to do with that excess. And then you have these cases like the Soviet Union that would, so everything tends toward producing excess. But you have certain cases like the Soviet Union where they couldn't produce an excess because they were such a deep hole. They had to fill that hole up before they could get to the point of producing an excess. But that's just the way systems work. I mean, I think he's just laying this, the notion of the general economy is that systems tend toward production, and they tend toward the production of excess. And then I think he's trying to account for why then, for example, in the case of the Soviet Union, did you not see that? Why did you not see the excess? Well, because they were working with such a deficit, they never got to that point of having an excess.
It's interesting you mentioned that too, because I was thinking, like, while I was reading this and while you were talking, like, how much of my personal viewpoints on what I feel is productive is determined by my economic system that I participate in. And that's what's called, like, I'm calling into question when I read Bataille and when I listen to the discussions here, because it's like, well, what do I consider productive? Like, if I'm not doing something producing excess that I can put back into the system, like mow my lawn or go out and do something that I can funnel back into like a capitalist economic system, then I'm not productive and I'm wasting time. But what if I do something that's not productive, like create art or do something? And maybe if that's what he's leaning towards, is like, and it's really making me call into question a lot of the perceptions that I just kind of take for granted of productivity and individualism and in economics. It's like what I just accept as the social economic norm in America currently.
I mean, I think what we're doing right now is an example of capitalist expenditure, because we have satisfied our needs, and so we have produced enough to where we can satisfy our needs. So now we have to do something with the excess, and this is one of the things we do with the excess. We buy books and we talk about ideas. There's societies where they don't have that ability. I mean, this is a luxury. What we're doing right now is a luxury. Me having 2 cars is a luxury. Me being able to drive 40 miles every day to work is a luxury. And so I think there is a tremendous amount of expenditure and excess expenditure in most of our lives right now. And I think, he would say, based on what he said earlier in the book, because capitalist societies, I mean, we do again plow a lot of our resources into increase of the means of production, but we generate so much that we have to blow off some of that stuff. And we do it by buying giant cars and by buying boats and taking vacations to Europe and declaring war on other nations and doing all this other kind of shit.
I would, yeah, I would say what we're doing right now, if it's a form of yeah, I'm not gonna argue it, you know, it could be a form of expenditure. I'll question whether it's a form of capitalist expenditure, because it doesn't really feed into or contribute to the capitalist economy. However, people who buy larger vehicles than what they need, right? That you could argue that's expenditure, but you could also argue that it feeds back into the economy. It just means they're gonna, you know, like a lot of you know, the acceleration and proliferation of false needs really is part of the way that the capitalist economy keeps growing, right? As an economy, by convincing people that they need to grow, they need to purchase more and more shit that they don't actually need. So it's, yeah, I think Bataille's point earlier that things are neither purely expenditure, neither purely do they feed into, you know, to the growth of the system, but that they can be both at the same time or different degrees, I think is a very good point to bring up. Yeah.
Well, maybe I misunderstood what he meant, or I've forgotten, but I thought that he was saying expenditure was explicitly stuff that did not contribute to the economy. So you have, because he talked about systems that would continue to grow, like when he talked about, you know, like literally natural systems like jungles and so on. You have these systems that naturally grow and grow and grow, but when they hit a limit of growth, you know, where they're plowing all their resources back into production and into growth, but then they hit some limit, and then what happens is you get just this compacting of expenditure. You know, like especially if you're in a geographically landlocked place, you just have all this excess beyond what you can possibly consume through the increasing of production. So I thought that he was saying expenditure was stuff that you had to get rid of because you couldn't plow it back into production.
Well, this kind of reminded me, there's this read a bit about, which is there's, you know, Bataille, like I said, Bataille positions himself as a socialist generally, he's a critic of capitalism, but there's this like Marxist critique of Bataille, which is when Bataille talks about capitalism, he always talks about it as if it's this ascetic, purely rationalist. I mean, he doesn't always talk about it like that, but that's how he generally defines it. And like, well, maybe that was true for the earliest stages of capitalism, especially as, like he says, when they're having to hide their wealth from the aristocracy, and there's not as much wealth to go around to. But that the critique is basically that his love of irrational expenditures, the way he described it, often doesn't seem that different than well, commodification, which is, you know, the buying, think about how much people spend on parties, on like I said, buying a better car, buying a, like, it's not rationally necessary, but it is part of the capitalist system. It does in itself actually go and feed the growth of the system, even though it's a seemingly irrational excess to spend that much money on. You go to a party, you spend all this money on wasteful stuff, but you bought all that stuff, and that feeds the economy back. And that, you know, even though he talks about capitalism always is ascetic, that in fact, you know, and therefore he's against it, that is, you know, his critique kind of in a way reproduces, defends modern capitalism, even if he doesn't intend it to.
Yeah, I think one thing to consider is that so it seems to me that production and what I'll call anti-production expenditure, that they're reciprocal, that they need each other. In the same way, an organism needs to have both some kind of means of taking in things from the outside world, of eating essentially, and also some kind of way of removing waste from itself. And so I think that's why he's saying that, yeah, okay, you're generally going to have, yeah, this production, but then there is going to be, yes, either growth and some kind of change, or there's going to be some kind of, these are forms of excess. It's either going to be growth, which I think is the primary kind of orientation of it. And then if that hits a limit, then it becomes expenditure. But the thing is, I think especially complex societies, or probably if you think of, so probably only Nevitt will get this, but think of complex societies in the sense that Alfred North Whitehead talked about them too. I'll just leave that there. No one will ever get it. But this expenditure, the way that that functions in a society goes into how production also is structured in the society. Okay, so the Aztecs, part of the expenditure, there's certain demarcations of where the production is coming from. The sun, the gods, sacrifice, these things. And then that gets also structured in how production occurs. So those feed back into each other in this reciprocal way. That's why production needs anti-production. It needs it in order to keep going the same kind of basic structure of production, so it doesn't just kind of disintegrate. In the same way, an organism, I think, has a similar thing going on, in sense of, okay, yes, you need to eat, but you also need to be able to have some kind of means of eliminating that waste that doesn't go to growth, that also enables you to just keep going. In the same, okay, in capitalism today or whatever, you know, I think to a certain degree, maybe this could be considered kind of ideological or whatnot, but you could consider something like, okay, I'm a stressed out graduate student. I need to produce this goddamn thesis. But in order to do that, I need to relax sometimes. So I better do that. So there'll be expenditure that kind of goes towards something. But then it's also feeding back into my production. So I may go relax tomorrow and sit out, you know, just do nothing in order to recuperate myself, in order to continue with my production. That's kind of a bad example. Don't take that too literally, but I think that's one way that's always going to be something reciprocal, that this expenditure is always going to be to a certain degree fed back, but in a different way into production. And those have to be seen as coupled together in some way.
So that quote I put doesn't, so Chase is trying to give a more nuanced, careful account. The quote I put in there is not that nuanced, but this is the kind of thing I was thinking about. This is all the way back when he was talking about potlatch, a surplus of resources which societies have constantly at their disposal at certain points, at certain times, cannot be the object of a complete appropriation. It cannot be usefully employed. It cannot be employed for the growth of productive forces, but the squandering of the surplus itself becomes an object of appropriation. So that's the kind of thing I was thinking about when he was saying that the squandering is something that occurs when you have an excess of resources beyond what is necessary for growth. But then, I don't know, Chase's comments seem to be reasonable as well, that there's a more complex relationship between the two.
Also, I want to say, like advanced capitalist society kind of problematize our notion of luxury, right? Because luxury, I mean, at least in Bataille's terms, if luxury feeds into the growth of the system, right? It's not, it's not the expenditure form of luxury that nobility before the Ancien regime, could just spend all this money on lavish parties, and once the party's done, what do you have to show for it? Nothing, right? Except some crazy memories, right? But nowadays, when somebody buys a yacht, right, that might give them something as a status symbol, but it feeds back into the systems. Just by way of example, right? What would happen if if Americans stopped buying luxury items, right? If Americans only focused on for the next 6 months, we're only going to buy the things we need and nothing more than we need, right? What would happen to our economy? It would certainly stop growing. And so, yeah, luxury isn't pure expenditure, at least in our current state of things.
Yeah, I think you could say that it seems almost like the defining feature of modern capitalist states is that luxury is almost completely reinserted back into production in some manner. Where, yeah, luxury has more of this kind of slippage, let's call it, away from production, where today now it's almost all forms of luxury and expenditure have been channeled back into reproducing the means of possibility for that production to keep going. That's why it seems like it's so impossible to do anything that's not productive. And this is also reflected in our thinking, where I remember we were talking about this before, when try to think of something unproductive to do, and but then it becomes like, well, why am I doing that? Ultimately, am I doing that to be productive itself? This form of kind of like an impossibility of a pure expenditure is, I think that's kind of that's the problematic that Bataille is facing. Yeah.
Add to that the culture industry, right? I mean, people think that they're just, enjoying a bit of luxury time. They're going to go into a dark room and enjoy a nice movie, okay? I'm just going to turn my brain off. I'm going to stop thinking about work. I'm so far away from work, okay? I'm just thinking about Captain America on the screen, right? Well, what's actually happening, right? What's actually happening is, there are forces working on you to keep you safely ensconced within the system, right? These movies are not purely neutral. They serve a purpose, right? And it's not, again, it's not just film. It's all over the place in the culture industry. It presents itself as, as useless, purposeless luxury, but it very much serves a function.
Where is Hunter to talk about ideology, for Pete's sake?
That's a good question. Maybe he's caught up in pure expenditure tonight, and that's why he can't contribute to the production of this.
I can't think of a better Zizek moment, and I feel like I have to say that for the sake of Hunter if he's watching right now. So we miss you, Hunter.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Hunter about Bataille's comments about Hegel and individualism and all that kind of stuff, but
yeah,
he's not
I wanted
here.
to ask him about that too, because I thought that was pretty.
We all read that.
Damning, yeah.
Maybe that's why he's not here.
Maybe next time he can give us a 20-minute drunk ramble about Hegel. We can only hope.
I love that. That was amazing. I really enjoyed that.
I don't know if you remember the last time he did it too. He said, I'll be quick. I'll only be about 5 minutes. I was like, 95% chance it's not 5 minutes. And he went on for 20. I think you're about right, Ripley. It was about 20.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's got this temporal distortion field thing going on. So yeah, I'm a little, maybe I shouldn't worry about, I'm a little worried about next time because there's only a few pages that we've talked about so much, but of this chapter already, but maybe, I guess we can just go for it. And if we run out of things to say, we can just ramble or quit early or something. So
I'm pretty good at rambling if need be. I can do it. But yeah, Hunter better be here next time. And also we need to demand that he account for Hegel and his statist ideology that Bataille does well to point out.
And the destruction of the individual. Yeah.
Can we argue that that's a misreading of Hegel, and Hegel was a radical individualist?
No.
Well, it reminds me of Antigone. No, I have to I feel like I'm channeling him. I need to stop. He needs to be here. I can't do Jackson and Hunter in one session.
Well, Bataille takes Kojève's interpretation of Hegel, right? So sure you ought to hate it because he's a Zizek fan. Zizek hates Kojève, so yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, but think of it this way, and I apologize because you all know more about this than I do, but as an analogy, and all analogies are weak because they're analogies. But when Kant, the metaphysics of morals, right? Isn't he talking about individual human beings, how they should live, how they should conduct themselves? And then what happened to Kantian insights when it was put at the societal level?
I don't know.
Let's talk
Talk to
about
Jonathan Rawls.
Kingdom of Ends. So I don't know.
If you just want to keep talking about Kant, I can stick around for quite a while.
Yeah, Eric's.
I don't know, Eric. What is enlightenment? What?
Well, so,
I am slightly terrified because the next week we're going to start Kant, and Eric's going to be sitting next to me, and I'm the whole time I'm going to be like, oh God, I know I got this wrong. I'm just waiting for these looks from Eric, like, what the fuck? So anyway, we'll see what happens.
Oh crap! It's 9:20. I'm sorry. Bye, Chase.
Oh, Joseph, before you leave, I hope we can talk about your last comments some other time. I know you.
Yeah, I would love to, because I feel like I put these in my notes, and what I think is for me, what I enjoy the most about this seminar is being able to hear you guys and kind of just talk some ideas out. So I would love to talk more about that.
Bye-bye.
Farewell, gentlemen. Wait.
Wale.